Colonialism and Countryside, archives exploring official archives. In this chapter you will see what colonial rule meant to be those who in countryside. You will meet the Rajmahal hills where the Paharis and the Santals lived, and then move to the Deccans. You will look at the way the English East India Company established its large Raj in the countryside, implement its revenue policies, what these policies meant to different sections of people, and how they changes their lives. Law introduced by the state have consequences for people. They determine to an extent who grows richer and who poorer, who acquires new land and who loses the land they have lived on, where peasants go they when they need money. As you see, however, people were not only subjects to the working of laws, they also resisted the laws by acting according to what they believed to be just. In doing so, people defined the way in which law operated, thereby modifying their consequences. You will you will also come to know about the sources that tell us about these histories and the problems historians face in the interpreting them. You will read about the revenue records and surveys, journals and accounts left by the surveyors and travelers, and report produced by inquiries and commission. This photo introduced cotton being carried from the village to the mandi. Illustrated London Views, 20 April 1861. Bengal and the Zamindars. As you know, colonial rule was first established in the Bengal. It is here that the earlier attempts were made to record rural society and establish a new regime and land rights and a new revenue system. Let us see what happened in Bengal in the early years of the Company East India rule. An auction in the Burdwan. In 1797, there was an auction in Burdwan, present day Burdwan. It was a big public event. A number of mahals, estates held by the Rajas of Burdwan were being sold, and the permanent settlement had come into operation in 1793. The East India Company had fixed the revenue that each zamindar had to pay. The estate of those who failed to pay were to be auctioned to recover the revenue. Since the Rajas had accumulated huge areas, his estate has been put up for auction. Numerous purchasers came to the auction and estate were sold to the highest bidder. But the collectors soon discovered a strange twist to the tale. Many of the purchasers turned out to be servants and the agents of the Rajas who had bought the lands on the behalf of their masters. Over 95% of the sales at the auction was fictitious, and Raja's estates had been publicly sold, but they remained in control of his zamindar. Why did the Rajas fail to pay the revenue? Who were the purchasers at the auction? What does the story tell us about the what happening in the rural eastern areas of eastern India at that time? The problem of unpaid revenue. The estate of the Burdwan Raj was not the only ones sold during the closing years of the 18th century. Over 75% of the zamindar changed hands after the permanent settlement. In introducing the permanent settlement, British officials hoped to resolve the problems they had been facing into the conquest of Bengal. By the 1770s, the rural economy in the Bengal was crisis. The recurrent families and declining agriculture output. Officials felt that agriculture, trade and the revenue resources of the state could all be developed by the encouraging investment in the agriculture. This could be done by securing rights of property and permanent fixing the rates of this photo indicates Burdwan Raja's city palace on Diamond Harbour Road, Calcutta. By the late 19th century, many rich zamindars of Bengal had palaces with ballrooms, large grounds, entrance porches supported by the Corinthians columns like this. Revenue demand. If the revenue demand of a state was permanently fixed, then the company could look forward to a regular flow of revenue, while entrepreneurs could feel sure of earning a profit from their investment, since the state would not siphon it off by increasing its claims. The process officials hoped could led by the emergency of the class of yeomen, farmers, and the rich landowners who would have the capitals and enterprise to improve agriculture nurtured by the British. This class would also be loyal to the company. The problem, however, lay in the identifying individuals who could both improve agriculture and the contract to pay the fixed revenue to the state. After a prolonged debate amongst company officials, the permanent settlement was made with the Rajas and Tokildars of Bengal. They were now classified as zamindars, and they had to pay a revenue demand that was fixed in the perpetuity. In terms of this definition, the zamindar was not a landowner in the villager but a revenue collector of the state. Zamindar had several, sometimes as many as 400 villagers under them. In company calculation, the villagers within one zamindar formed one revenue estate. The company fixed the total demand over the entire estate. Those revenue the zamindar contracted to pay. The zamindar collected rent from the different villages, paid the revenue to the company, and retained the difference as his income. He was expected to pay company regularly, failing which his estate could be auctioned. This photo Charles Cornwallis, 1738 to 1805, painted by Thomas Gainsborough, 1785. He was the commander of British forces during the American War of Independence and the Governor General of Bengal when the permanent settlement was introduced in 1793. Tokildars. What Tokildar literally means one who hold a tokil or the connection. Tokil came to refer as a territorial unit. Why zamindar demand on payments? Company officials felt that a fixed revenue demand would give zamindars a sense of security, land sure of returns on their investment, encourage them to improve their estates. In the early decades after the permanent settlement, however, zamindars regularly failed to pay the revenue demands and the unpaid balance accumulated. The reason for this failure were various. First, the initial demands were very high. This was because it was felt that if the demand was fixed for all time to company, the company could never be able to claim a share of increasing income from the land when the prices rose and cultivation expanded. To minimize this anticipated loss, the company pegged the revenue demand high, arguing that the burden on zamindar would gradually decline as agriculture production expanded and price rose. Second, these high demands were imposed in 1790, a time when the prices of agriculture produced were depressed, making it difficult for the rayats to pay their dues to the zamindars. If the zamindar could not collect the rent, how could he pay the company? Third, the revenue was invariable regardless of the harvest and had to paid punctually. In fact, according to the sunset law, if payment did not come in by the sunset of the specified date, the zamindar was liable to be auctioned. Fourth, the permanent settlement limited the power of zamindar to collect rent from the rayats and manage his zamindari. The company had recognized the zamindar as important, but it wanted to control and regulate them, subdue their authority and restrict their autonomy. The zamindar troops were disbanded, customs duties abolished, and their kachaharis means court brought under the supervision of a collector appointed by the company. Zamindar lost their power to organize local justice and the local police. Over the time, the collectorate emerged as an alternative center of authority, severely restricting what the zamindar could do. In one case, when a raja failed to pay revenue, a company official was speedily dispatched to his zamindar with explicit instruction to take charges of the district and to use the most effectual means to destroy all influence and the authority of the Raja and his officer. Rayats is the way the term Rayats used to designate peasants in chapter 8 was spelt in English records. Rayat in Bengal did not always cultivated the land directly but leased it out to under Rayats. At the time of rent collection, an officer of zamindar, usually the amlah, came around to the village, but rent collection was to perennial problem. Sometimes bad harvest and low prices made permanent of dues difficult for the riots. At the other, riot deliberately delayed payment. Rich riots and the village headmen, jotdars and mandals were only too happy to see the zamindars in trouble. The zamindar could therefore not easily assert his power over them. Zamindar could prosecute defaulters, but the judicial process was long drawn. In the Bardhaman alone, there were over 3,000 pending suits for arrears of rent payment in 1798. The rise of jotdars. While many zamindars were facing a crisis at the end of 18th century, a group of rich peasants were consolidated their position in the village. In Francis Buchanan's survey of the Dinajpur district in the North Bengal, we have a vivid description of this class of rich peasants known as jotdars. By the early 19th century, jotdars had acquired vast area of land, sometimes as much as several thousands of acres. They collected local trade as well as money lending, exercising immense power over the poorer cultivators of their region. A large part of their lands was cultivated through the sharecroppers, adiyars or barghadars, who brought their own long labored in the field and handed over half the produce to the jotdars after the harvest. Within the village, the power of jotdars was more effective than the zamindars. Unlike zamindars who often lived in the urban areas, jotdars were located in village and exercised directly control over a considerable section of poor villages. They sincerely resented efforts by zamindar to increase the jama of the village, prevented zamindari's officials from executing their duties, mobilized riots who were dependent on them, and deliberately delayed payments of revenue to the zamindars. In fact, when estate of the zamindar who auctioned for failure to make revenue payment, jotdars were often amongst the purchasers. Bengal village scene painted by George Chinry in 1820. Chinry stayed in India for 23 years, 1802 to 1825, painting portraits, landscape and sceneries of everyday life of common people. Jotdars and moneylenders in rural Bengal lived in houses like one of seen in on right. The Jotars were most powerful in North Bengal, although the rich peasants and the village headmen were emerging as commanding figures in the countryside in other part of Bengal as well. In some places they were called Hollanders. Elsewhere they were known as Jantidars or Mandals. Their rise inevitably weakened Zamindari authority. The Jotars of Dinajpur. Buchanan described the ways in which the Jotars of Dinajpur in North Bengal resisted being disciplined by the zamindars and undermined his power. Landlords do not like this class of men, but it is evident that they are absolutely necessary unless the landlords themselves would advance money to their necessitous tenantry. The Jotars who cultivated large proportion of lands are very refractory and known that the zamindar have no power over them. They pay only a few rupees on account of their revenue and then fall in the balance almost every kist installment. They hold more lands than they were entitled by their pothas, deeds of contract. Should the zamindars officers in the consequences summon them to the kachari and detained them for 1 or 2 hours within a view to reprimand them, they immediately go and complain at the Fauzdari Thana police station for imprisonment, and at the Mufassil, a judicial officer at the lower court kacharis, for being dishonored. And while the causes continue unsettled, they instigate the petty riots not to pay their revenue consequently. सबसे ऊपर कंपनी, फिर जमींदार, फिर सबसे नीचे अंडर रैयत्स के ऊपर जोतदार, अंडर रैयत्स के ऊपर रैयत, और फिर रैयत जोतदार और रैयत सेम कैटेगरी में, उसके ऊपर जमींदार के ऊपर कंपनी. जमींदार्स वर रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर paying revenue to the company, distributing the revenue demand jamas over village, each village riots being or small, paid rent to the zamindar. Jotars gave out loan to the other riots and sold their produce. Riots cultivated some land and gave out the rest to the under riots on rent. Under riots paid rent to the riots. Power in the rural Bengal. Read the text accompanying in figure 10.5 carefully and insert the following terms in appropriate places along the arrows: rent, revenue, interest, loan, and produce. The zamindars resist. The authority of the zamindars in rural areas, however, did not collapse. They faced an exorbitantly high revenue demand and possible auction of their estate. They devised way of serving the pressures. New contest produced new strategies. Fictitious sale was one such strategy. It involves a series of monogamous. The Rajas of Burdwan, for instance, first transferred some of his zamindaris to his mother, since the companies had decreed that the property of a man would not be taken over. Then, as a second move, his agents manipulated the actions. The revenue demand of the company was deliberated within hell, and unpaid balance were allowed to accumulate. When a part of the estate was auctioned, the zamindars' men brought the property outbidding other purchasers. Subsequently, they refused to pay up the purchase money, so the estate had to be resold. Once again it was brought by the zamindar's agent. Once again the purchase money was not paid, and once again there was an action. This process was repeatedly endlessly exhausting the estate and other bidders at the auction. At last the estates was sold to the low price back to the zamindar. The Zamindars never paid the full revenue demand. The company rarely recovered the unpaid balance that had piled up. Such transactions happened on the grand scale between 1793 and 1801. Four big zamindars of Bengal, including Burdwan, made Benami purchases that collectively yield as much as rupees 30 lakh of the total sales at the auctions. Over 15% were auctions. Maharaja Mehtab Chand 1820 to 1879. When the permanent settlement was imposed, Tej Chand was the Raja of Burdwan. Subsequently, under the Mehtab Chand, the states prospered. Mehtab Chand helped the British during the Santhal rebellion and the 1857 revolt. There were other ways in which zamindars circumvented displacement. When people from outside the zamindaris brought an estate at auction, they could not always take possession. At times, their agents would be attacked by lathials of the former zamindar. Sometimes even the riots resist the entry of outsider. They felt bound to their own zamindar through a sense of loyalty and perceived him as a figure of authority in themselves as his projas subjects. The sale of the zamindar disturbed their sense of identity. They pride the zamindars therefore were not easily displaced. By the beginning of the 19th century, the depression in the prices was over. Thus those who had survived the troubles of the 1790 consolidated their power. Rules of the revenue repayment were also made somewhat flexible. As a result, zamindar power over the village was strengthened. It was only during the Great Depression of the 1930s that they finally collapsed. The Jotdars consolidated their power in the countryside. The fifth report. Many of the changes we are discussing were documented in the detail in the report that was submitted to the British Parliament in 1813. It was the fifth of the series of report on the administration and activities of the East India Company in India, often referred to as the fifth report. It ran into 1002 pages, of which over 800 pages were appended and the reproduced petition of zamindars and riot. Reports of the collectors from different district, statistical table on revenue return, and notes on the revenue and judicial administration of Bengal and Madras, present day Tamil Nadu, written by officials. From the time the company established its rule in Bengal in the mid 1760s, its activities were closely watched and debated in England. Benami, literally anonymous, is a term used in the Hindi and several other Indian languages for transaction made in the name of fictitious or relatively insignificant person, whereas the real beneficiary remains unnamed. Lathials, literally one who wield the lathi or sticks, functions as the strong man of the zamindar. There were many groups in the Britain who were opposed to the monopoly that the East India Company had over the trade with India and China. These groups wanted a revocation of the royal charter that gave the company this monopoly. An increasing number of private traders wanted a share in the Indian trade, and the industrialists of Britain were keen to open up the Indian market for British manufacturers. Many political groups argued that the conquest of Bengal was benefited only the East India Company but not the British nation as a whole. Information about the company misrule and the malal administration was hotly debated in the Britain. An incident of the greed and corruption of the company officials were widely publicized in the press. The British Parliament passes a series of acts in the late 18th century to regulate and control company rule in India. It forced the company to produce regular reports on the administration of India and appoint committees to inquire into the affairs of the company. The fifth report was one such report produced by the Select Committee. It became the basis of intense parliamentary debate on the nature of East India Company rule in India. Adul Raj Palace. Adul Raj Palace. The ruins of palace are a visible sign of end of an era. Satyajit Ray famous film Zahalghar on the decline of aristocratic zamindari's style of living was shot in the Adul Raj Palace. Adul Raj Palace. For over a century and a half, the fifth report was snapped our conception of what happened in the rule of Bengal in late 18th century. The evidence contained in the fifth report is invaluable, but official reports like this have to be read carefully. We need to know who wrote the reports and why they were written. In fact, recent researches show that the arguments and evidence offered by the fifth report cannot be accepted uncritically. Researchers have carefully examined the archives of various Bengal zamindars and local records of records of districts to write about the history of colonial rule in rural Bengal. They indicated that intent on criticizing the maladministration of the company. The fifth report aggregated the collapse of traditional zamindari's power, as also estimated the scale on which zamindars were losing their lands. As we have seen, even when zamindars were unauctioned, zamindaris was not always displaced. Given the ingenious methods they used to retain their zamindaris. From the fifth report, referring to the condition of zamindars and the auctions of land, the fifth report states the revenue was not realized with punctuality and lands to a considerable extent were periodically exposed to sale by auction. In the native year 1203, corresponding with the 1796 to 1797, the land advertised for sale comprehended a Jamuna or assessment of Sika rupees 28,70,061. The extent of land actually sold bore a Jamuna or assets of 14,18,756 and the amount of purchase money Sika rupees 1790 to 17,90,416 in 1204, corresponding with the 1797 to 1798. The land advertised was for Sika rupees 26,66,191. The quantity sold was for Sika rupees 22,74,076 and the purchase money Sika rupees 21,47,580. Among the defaulters were some of the oldest families of the country. Such were the Rajas of Nudia, Rajeshia, Bisfor, all the districts of Bengal, Behensfor, and others. The dismemberment of the whose estate at the end of each succeeding year threatened them with poverty and ruin, and in some instance presented difficulties to the revenue officer in their efforts to preserve undiminished the amount of public assets. From the tone in which evidence is recorded, what do you think is the attitude of nature to the facts narrated? What is the report trying to say through the figures? Can you rethink of any problem in making long-term generalization and these figures of 2 years? Discuss. Compare the amount of zamindars you have just read with the chapter 8. the Ho and the Plong. Let us now shift out focus from wetlands of Bengal to drier zone, from a region of settled cultivated to one where shifting agriculture was practiced. You will see the changes that came about when the frontiers of the peasants' economy expanded outward, showing up pastures and forest in the Rajmahal's hill. You will also see how these changes created a variety of conflict within the region. In the hills of Rajmahal in the early 19th century, Buchanan traveled through the Rajmahal hills. From his description, the hills appear impenetrable, a zone where few travelers venture, an area that significant danger wherever he went. People were hostile, apprehensive of officials, and unwilling to walk to them. In many instances, they deserted their village and absconded. Who were these hill folk? Why were they so apprehensive of Buchanan's visit? Buchanan's journal gives us a tantalizing glimpse of these hills folk in the early 19th century. This journal was written as diary of places he visited, people he encountered, and the practices he saw. It raises question in our mind but does not always help us answer them. It tells us about a moment in time but not about the longer history of the people and the places. For the historians have to turn to other records. If we look at late 19th century revenue records, we learn that these hill folk were known as Paharians. They lived around the Rajmahal hills, subsisting on forest produced and the practicing shifting cultivation. They cleared patches of forest by cultivating bushes and the burning the undergrowth. On these patches enriched by the potash and the ash, the Paharis grew a variety of pulses and millets for consumption. They scratched the ground lightly with hoes, cultivated the cleared land for few years, then left it swallow so that it could recover its fertility and move to a new area. From the forest they called mahuas, a flower for wood, silk, cocoons, and resin for sails, the wood for charcoal production, and the undergrowth that spread like a mat below the trees, and the patches of grass that covered the land left fallow provided pasture for cattle. Who are Buchanan? Francis Buchanan was a physician who came to India and served in the Bengal medical service from 1794 to 1815. For a few years he was surgeon to the Governor General of India, Lord Wellesley. During his stay in Calcutta, present-day Kolkata, he organized a zoo that became Calcutta Alipore Zoo. He was also in charge of botanical garden for a short period on the request of government of Bengal. He undertook detailed survey of the areas under the jurisdiction of British East India Company. In 1815 he fell ill and returned to the England. Upon his mother's death he inherited her property and assumed her family named Hamilton, so he is often called Buchanan Hamilton. A view of hill village in Rajmahal, painted by William Hodges in 1782. William Hodges was a British artist who accompanied Captain Hook on his second voyage to the Pacific 1772 to 1775, and then came to India in 1781 to become a friend of Augustus Cleveland, the collector of Bhagalpur. On the invitation of Cleveland, the Hodges accompanied him to the jungles Mahals in 1782 and painted a set of aqueducts like many other British painters of this time. Hodges' research for picturesque artists in search of picturesque were inspired by the ideas of Romanticism, a tradition thought that celebrated nature and admired its significance and power. Romanistics felt that to accumulate with nature and artists to represent nature as an ideal uncorrupted by modern civilization, discover unknown land shades and appreciated by the sublime play of light and shade. It is search for this unknown was Hodges went to the Rajmahal hills. He found flat landscape monotonous and discovered beauty in roughness, irregularity and variety, a landscape that colonial officials found dangerous and valid. People by turbulent tribes appear in the painting of Hodges as exotic and idyllic. Look at the painting, identify the way in which it represents the tradition of pictures qui. They live in huts, trees. They make houses from trees, huts, live on hills. The life of Paharis as a hunter, shifting cultivator, food gatherer, charcoal producer, silkworm rearers was thus intimated, connected to the forest. They live in a huntsman with tamarinds groves and rested in the shades of mango tree. They considered the entire region as their land and the basis. Aquatint is a picture produced by cutting into copper sheet with acid and then painting it. A view of jungle territory painted by William Hodges. Here Hodges. Here you can see the forest, low hills and the rocky upper ranges now were actually above 20,000 feet. By centering the hills and viewing them from below, Hodges emphasizes their inaccessibility. Describe how the picture represents the relation between tribal people and nature. They live in forest. Of their identity as well as survival, and they resisted as intrusive of outsider. Their chiefs maintained the unity of the group, settled dispute and led the tribes in battles with other tribes and plains people. With this base in the hills, the Paharian regularly raided the plains where settled agriculturalists lived. These raids were necessary for survival, particularly in a year of scarcity. They were a way of asserting power over settled communities, and they were mean of negotiating political relations with the outsider. The zamindars on the plains had to often purchase peace by paying a regular tribute to the hill chiefs. Traders similarly gave a small amount to the hill folks for permission to use the passes controlled by them. Once the toll was paid, the Paharian chiefs protect the traders, ensuring that their goods was not plundered by anyone. Plundered by Lutna. This negotiated peace was somewhat fragile. It broken down in the last decades of 8th centuries when the frontiers of settled agriculture were being aggressively extended in East India. The British encouraged forest clearance, and zamindars and jotdars turned uncultivated lands into rice fields. The British extension of settled agriculture was necessary to enlarge the source of land revenue, produce crops for export. They established the basis of settled, ordered society. They also associate forest with the wilderness and saw forest people as savage, unruly, primitive and difficult to govern. So they felt that forest had to be declared. Settled agriculture established and forest people tamed, civilized and persuaded to give up hunting and take to prolong agriculture. As settled agriculture expanded, the area under forest and pastures contracted. This sharpened the conflict between hill flock and the settled cultivators. The former began to raid settled villages with the increasing regularity, carrying away food grains and cattle. Exasperated colonial officials tried desperately to control and subdue the Paharians, but they found the task difficult. In the 1770s, the British embarked on a brutal policy of extermination, hunting the Paharians down and killing them. Then, by the 1780s, Augustus Cleveland, the collector of Bhagalpur, proposed a policy of pacification. Paharians chiefs were given an annual allowance and made responsible for proper conduct of their men. They were expected to maintain order in their localities and discipline their own peoples. Many Paharians chiefs refused the allowance. Those who accepted most often lost authority within the community. Being in the pay of colonial government, they came to perceived as sub-oriented employees or stipendiary chiefs. As the pacification campaigns continued, the Paharians withdrew deep into the mountains, insulating themselves from hostile forces and carrying on a war with outsiders. So when Buchanan traveled through a region in the winter of 1810 to 1811, the Paharians naturally view him with the suspicious and distrust. The experience of pacifications campaign and the memories of brutal repression shaped their perception of British infiltration into the area. Every white man appeared to represent a power that was destroying their way of life and means of survival, snatching away their control over the forest and land. By this time, in fact, there were newer intimations of danger. Santhals were pouring into the areas, clearing forest, cutting down timbers, plowing land and growing rice and cotton. As the lower hills were taken over Santhal settlers, the Paharians receded deeper into Rajmahals. If Paharians' life was is symbolized by the hoe, which they used for shifting cultivation, the settlers came to represent the power of plong. The battle between the hoe and the plong was a long one. The Santhal pioneer settlers. At the end of 1830, Buchanan crossed the Gujarians Pahar, which was part of Rajmahal ranges, passed through the rocky country beyond the reach of village. It was an old village, but the land around had been recently cleared to extend cultivation. Looking at the landscape, Buchanan found evidence of the region having been transformed through a proper application of human labor. He wrote, Gunjarian is just significantly cultivated to show what around 1800 displaced the hill folks into hill folks who live on these lower slopes, cleared the forest and settled the land. How did the Santhals reach the Rajmahal hills? The Santhals had begun to come into Bengal around 1780. Zamindars hired them to reclaim land and expand cultivation. The British officials invited them to settle in the Jahangir Mahals, having failed to subdue the Paharians and transform them into the settled agriculturists, and British turned to the Santhals. The Paharians refused to cut trees, resist touching the plong, and continue to be hill. Figure 10.10. Hill village in the Santhal country, illustrated London News 23 February 1856. This view in the lower Rajmahal Hills was sketched by the Walter Shelby in the early 1850s. The village appeared to be peaceful, calm, idyllic. Life seemed unaffected by the outside world. पेड़ आराम से लोग हट्स में रह रहे हैं. Life is turbulent. The Santhal, by contrast, appeared to the idea settlers clearing forest and plowing the land with vigor. The Santhals were given land and persuaded to settle in the foothills of Rajmahal. By 1832, a large area of land was demarcated as Damin-in-Koh. This was declared to be land of Santhals. They were to live within it, practice plowing agriculture, and become settled peasants. The land granted to the Santhals stipulated that at least 1/10 of the area was to be declared and cultivated within the first 10 years. The territory was surveyed and mapped, enclosed with the boundary pillars. It was separated from both the world of settled agriculturists of the plains and the Paharians of the hills. After the demarcation of the Din-e-Koh, Santhal settled expanded rapidly from 40 Santhal villagers in the area in 1838. As many as 1473 villagers had came up by 1851. Over the same period of Santhal population increased from a mere to 3,000 to over 82,000. As cultivation expanded, and increased volume of revenue flowed into the company's coffers. Santhal's myths and songs of 18th century refer very frequently to the long history of travel. They represent the Santhal past as one of the continuous mobility, a tireless search for the place of settle. Here the Damin-e-Koh, their journey seemed to have come to the end when the Santhals settled on the peripheries of the Rajmahal Hills. Paharians resist but were ultimately forced to withdraw deeper into the hills, restricted from moving down to the lower hills and valleys. They were confined to the dry interior and to the more barren and the rocky upper hills. This severely affected their lives, impoverising them in the long term. Shifting agriculture depend on the ability to move to newer and newer land and utilize to the natural fertility of the soil. When the most fertile soil becomes inaccessible to them, being part of the Damin and Paharis could not effectively sustain their mode of cultivation. When the forests of region were cleared for cultivation, the hunter among them also faced problems. The Santhal, by contrast, gave up their early life of mobility and settled down, cultivating a range of commercial crops for market and dealing with traders and money lenders. The Santhals, however, soon found that the land they had brought under cultivation was slipping away from their hands, and the state was levying heavy taxes on the land that the Santhal has cleared. Money lenders, dukes, were charging them high rates of interest and taking over the land when debt remained unpaid. The zamindar were asserting control over the Damin areas. By the 1850, the Santhal felt that the time had come to rebel against zamindar, moneylenders, and the colonial state in order to create a idea world for themselves where they would rule. It was after the Santhal revolt 1855 to 1856 that were the Santhal Parganas were created, carving out 5,500 square miles from the district of Bhagalpur and Birbhum. The colonial state hoped that by creating a new territorial for the Santhals and imposing some special laws within it, the Santhals could be conciliated. Sidhu Manjini, the leader of Santhal rebellion. Santhal fight the Sipahis of British Raj. Illustrated, London News, 23 February 1856. The rebellion charged the British perception of Santhals. Villagers that had early seemed calm and peaceful now appear to have become place of violent and savage deed. Burning of Santhal villages. Illustrated in London News, 23 February 1856. After the rebellion was cursed, the region was searched, expected were picked up, and villagers sent on fire. Images of burning village were shown down to the public in England. Once rebellion as demonstration of the might of British and their ability to crush. Image. You are a leader of the Illustrated London News in England. How will you react to the image depicted in figure 10.12, 10.13 and 10.14 नीचे? What image of Santhals would this picture create in your mind? They forced by British East India Company for labors, and they are fighting for their own. The region was searched, suspect were picked up, and village set on fire. Burning to show public once again demonstrated might British there applied their rebellion post-colonial. Santhal prison been taken away. Illustrated in London News, 1856. Notice how images like this one seek to convey political message. At the center you can see British officers triumphantly riding an elephant. One officer on the horse is smoking a hookah, a picture that emphasizes that the time of trouble was over. The rebellion had been crushed. The rebels are now in chains, being taken away to jail, escorted and surrounded by soldiers of the company. ये हुक्का पी रहा है, ये एलिफेंट पे बैठा हुआ है. Source 3. Buchanan on the Santhals. Buchanan wrote, they are very clever in clearing new lands, but leave mainly their huts with no fence, and their walls are made up of small sticks placed upright close together and plastered within with clay. They are small and slovenly and too flatted roofed with very little arch. The account of Buchanan. We have been drawing on Buchanan's account, but while writing this report we should not forget that he was an employee of British East India Company. His journeys were not simply inspired by the whole love of landscape and the desire to discover the unknown. He marched everywhere. What a large army of people, draughtsmen, surveyors, palanquins, bearers, coolies. The cost of the travelers were borne by the East India Company, since it needed information that Buchanan was expected to collect. Buchanan was specific instruction about what he had to look for and what he had to record. When he arrived at village with his army of people, he was immediately perceived as an agent of Sarkar. As the company consolidated its power and expanded its commerce, it looked for natural resources it could control and exploit. It surveyed landscape and the revenue sources, organized voyages of discovery, and sent it geologists and geographers, its botanists and medical men to the collect information. Buchanan, undoubtedly an extraordinary observer, was one such individual. Everywhere Buchanan went, he obsessively observed the stone and rocks and different strata and layers of soil. He searched for mineral and stones that were commercially valuable. He recorded all sign of iron ore and mica, granite and saltpeter. He carefully observed local practices of salt making and iron ore mining rocks near Kaduya. Buchanan's journal is packed with the observation like following. About a mile further on, first came to know came to a low ledge of rocks without any evident strata. It is a small grained granite with the reddish feldspar with quartz and the black mica. More than half a mile from there thence I came to another rock not stratified and consisting of very fine grained granite with the yellowish feldspar, whitish quartz and black mica. When Buchanan wrote about a landscape, he most often described not what he saw, what the landscape was like, but also how it could be transformed and made more productive, what crops could be cultivated, which trees cut down, and which one grows. And we must remember that his vision and his priorities were different from those of the local inhabitants. These assessments of what was necessary was shaped by the commercial concern of the company and modern Western notation of what constituted progress. He was inevitably critical of the lifestyles of the forest dwellers and felt that forest had to be turned into agriculture lands. Source 5 on the clearance and settled cultivation. Passing through one village in the lower Rajmahar hills, Buchanan wrote, "A view of the country is exceeding fine. The cultivation, especially the narrow valley of the rice winding in all directions, the cleared lands with the scattered trees and rocky hills are in perfection, and all that is wanted is some appearance of progress in the areas and a vastly extended and improved cultivation of which the country is highly susceptible. A plantation of asan and pals and tesar silkworm and lac should occupy the place of woods to as great an extent as the demand will admit. The remainder might be all cleared and greater part cultivated, while what is not fit for the purpose might near Plamira and Muva in Mahua." What does Buchanan tell us about his ideas of development? Illustrate your argument by the quoting for the excerpts. If you were a Pahari forest dweller, how would you have reacted to these ideas? Revolt in the countryside, the Bombay Deccan. You have read about how the lives of peasants and zamindars of colonial Bengal and Paharis and Santals of the Rajmahal Hills were changing. Now let us move across to the Western India and to the later period and explore what was the happening in the countryside in Bombay Deccan. One way of exploring such changes is by focusing on the peasant revolts. In such climatic times, rebels express their anger and the fury. They rise against what they perceive to the injustice and cause of their suffering. If we try to understand the premises of their resentment and peel the layer of their angers, we get a glimpse of their life and experience that is otherwise hidden from us. Revolt also produce records that historians can look at, all armed by action of rebels and keep on restoring others. State authority do not simply repress a rebel, they try to understand it, inquire into its causes so that policies can be formulated and peace established. These inquiries produce evidence that historians can explore. Through the 19th century, peasants in the various parts of India rose in revolt against moneylenders and land dealers. One such revolt occurred in 1875 in Deccan. On that day in Supa, on 16 May 1875, the district magistrate of Pune wrote to police commissioner, on arrival at Supa on Saturday 15 May, I learned of the disturbance. One house of the moneylender was burnt down, about a dozen were forcibly broken into and the completely gutted of their content. Account papers, bonds, grains, country clothes were burnt in the streets where heaps of ashes are still to be seen. The chief constable apprehended 50% stolen property worth of rupees 2000 was recovered. That estimated loss is over 25,000. Moneylender claim it over 1 lakh. Account books are burnt. The movement began at Supa, a large village at present day Pune district. It was market centered where land shopkeepers, moneylenders live. On 12 May 1875, raids from the surrounding rural areas gathered and attacked the shopkeepers, demand their Bhahi Katha account book and Bahi Khata and debt bond. They burnt the khatas, looted the grain shops, and in some cases set fire to the houses of sahukars. And Pune, the revolt spread to Ahmednagar. Then, over the next 2 months, it spread even further. Over an area of 6,500 square kilometer, more than 30 villages were affected. Everywhere the pattern was the same. Sahukars were attacked, account books burnt, and debt bonds destroyed. Terrified of peasants' attacker, the Sahukars failed the villagers, of very often leaving the property and belongings behind. As the revolt spread, British officials saw the spectre of 1857. Police posted were established. Police posts were established in the village to frighten rebellions, peasants into submission. Troops were quickly called in. 951 people were arrested and many convicted, but it took several months to bring the countryside under control. Sahukar was someone who acted both as moneylender and a trader. A newspaper report. The following report titled The Rayat and the Moneylender appear in the Native Opinion 6 June 1876 was the quoted in the report of Native newspaper of Bombay. The word and the term used by a writer often tell us something about his or her prejudicial. Read source 7 carefully and pick out the term that indicates any prejudice of the writer. Discuss how our rights and areas would have described the same situation. Source 7. The following report entitled The Rayat and the Moneylenders appeared in the Native Opinion 6 June 1876 and was quoted in the report of native newspapers of Bombay. The riots play first place spines on the boundaries of the riots first spied on the boundaries of their villages to see if any government officials come and to give timely intimation of their arrivals to the offenders. They were ashamed in the body and go to the houses of their creditors and demand from them a surrender of their bonds and other documents, threaten them in case of refusal with assault and the plunder. If the any government officials happens to approach the villagers where the above is taking place, the spies give intimation to the offenders and later displeased in time. Why the burning of bonds and deeds? Why this revolt? What does it tell us about the Deccan countryside and the and about our agrarian changes under the colonial rule? Let us look to this longer history of changes over 19th century. A new revenue system. As British rule expanded from Bengal to other parts of India, new system of revenue were imposed. The permanent settlement was rarely extended to any region beyond Bengal. Why was this so? One reason was that after 1810 agriculture prices rose, increasing the value of a harvest produced and enlarging the income of Bengal zamindars. Since the revenue demand was fixed under the permanent settlement, the colonial state could not claim any share of this enhanced income. Keen on expanding its financial sources, the colonial government had to think of ways to maximize its land revenue. So in territories annexed in the 19th century, temporary revenue settlements were made. There were other reasons too. When the official devised policies, their thinking is deeply shaped by the economic theories they are familiar with. By the 1820s, the economics David Ricardo was a celebrated figure in England. Colonial officials had learned Ricardian's ideas during their college years. In Maharashtra, when British officials set about formulating the term of the early settlement in 1820, they operated with some of these ideas. According to Ricard ideas, a landowner should have a claim only to be average rent. They prevailed at a given time. When the land yield more than the average rent, the landowner had a surplus that the state needed to be taxed. If the tax was not levied, cultivators were likely to be turned into rentiers, and their surplus income was unlikely to be productively invested in the improvement of the land. Many British officials in India thought that the history of Bengal confirms Ricardo's theory. There, the zamindars seem to have turned into rentiers, leased out land and living on the rental income. It was therefore necessary. The British officers now felt to have a different system. The revenue system that was introduced in the Bombay Deccans came to know as Rayatwadi. Right. Rentiers is a term used to designate people who live on rental income from property. Settlement. Unlike the Bengal system, the revenue was directly settled with the Rayat. The average income from different type of soil was estimated. The revenue paying capacity of ryots were asserts and the proportion of it fixed as the share of the state. The land were resurveyed every 30 years and the revenue rates increased. Therefore, the revenue demand was no longer permanent. Revenue demand and peasants' debt. The first revenue settlement in the Bombay Deccan was made in the 1820. The revenue that was demanded was so high that in many places peasants deserted their village, migrants to new region. In areas of poor soil and fluctuating rainfall, the problem was particularly acute when rain failed and harvests were poor. Peasants found it impossible to pay the revenue. However, the collector in charge of revenue collection were keep on demonstrating their efficiency and pleasing their superiors, so they went about extracting payment with utmost severity. When someone failed to pay, his cars were seized, a fine was imposed on the whole village. By the 1930, the problem became more severe. Prices of agriculture products fell sharply after 1832 and did not recover for over a decade and a half. This meant a further decline in the peasants' income. At the same time, the countryside was devastated by a famine that struck in the year 1832 to 1834. One third of cattle of the Deccan were killed, and half of human population died. Those who survived had no agricultural stocks to see them through the crisis. Unpaid balance of revenue mounted. How did cultivation live through such years? How did they pay the revenue, procure their consumption needs, purchase their plows and cattle, or get their children married? Inevitable, they borrowed. Revenue could rarely to be paid without a loan from a money lender, but once a loan was taken, the ryots found it difficult to pay it back. As debt mounted and loan remained unpaid, peasants' depend on the moneylender increased. They now needed loan even to buy their everyday needs and meet their production expenditure. By the 1840, officials were finding evidence of alarming level of peasants' indebtedness everywhere. By the mid 1840, there were signs of economical recovery of sorts. Many British officers had begun to realize that the settlement of 1920 had been harsh. The revenue demand was exorbitant, the system rigid, and the peasants' economy on the verge of collapse. So the revenue demand was moderate to encourage peasants to expand cultivation. After 1845, agriculture prices recovered steadily. The cultivators were now extending their acreage, moving into new areas and transforming pasture land into cultivated land. But to expand cultivation, peasants need more plough and cattle. They need money to buy seeds and land. For all this, they had to turn once again to money lenders for loan. Index line, the cotton boom. The line in the graph indicates the rise and fall of the cotton prices. Cotton boom in 1764, 1762, 64, 63 में cotton boom 500 टच किया था. Then came the cotton boom. Before the 1863, fourth of the raw cotton import from Britain came from America. British cotton manufacturers had for long been worried about this dependence on American supplies. What would happen if this source was cut off? Troubled by this question, they eagerly looked for alternative source of supply. In 1857, Cotton Supply Association was founded in Britain, and in 1859 the Manchester Cotton Company was formed. Their objective was to encourage cotton production in every part of the world. Carts transporting cotton halt under the banyan tree. Illustrated London News in 13 December 1862. Carts transporting cotton. Suited for its growth, India was seized as a country that could supply cotton to Lancashires if the American supply dried up. It possesses suitable soil, a climate favorable to the cotton cultivation and cheap labors. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, a wave of panic spread through the cotton circle in Britain. Raw cotton import from America fell to less than 3% of normal, or from over 20 lakh bales of 400 pounds each in 1861 to 55,000 bales in 1862. Frantic messages were sent to India and elsewhere to increase cotton export in Britain. In Bombay, cotton merchant visited the cotton district. He assured supplies and encouraged cultivation. As cotton prices soared, merchants in Bombay were kept to secure as much as cotton as possible to meet the British demand. So they gave advance to urban sahukars, who in turn extend credit to those rulers, moneylender who promised to secure the produce. When there is a boom in the market, credit flow easily, for those who gave out loan feel secure about recovering their money. Transporting cotton before the railway era. Illustrated Cotton News, 20 April 1860. When the cotton supply from America were cut off during the Civil War, Britain hoped that India would supply all the cotton that British industry needed. It began assessing the supplies, examining the quality of cotton, and studying the method of production and marketing. The interest were reflected in the pages of illustration and news. This development had a profound impact on the Deccan countryside. The ryots in the Deccan villages suddenly found access to seemingly limitless credit. They were being given ₹100 in advance for every acres they planted with cotton. Sahukars were more than willing to extend long-term loans. While the American crisis continued, cotton production in the Bombay Deccan expanded. Between 1860 to 1864, cotton acreage doubled. By the 1862, over 90% of cotton imports into Britain were coming from India. But these boom years did not bring prosperity to the all cotton producer. Some rich peasants did gain, but for the large majority, cotton expansion meant heavier debt. Fleet of boats carrying cotton bales down the Ganges from Mirzapur. Illustrated London News, Summer 1862. Cotton bales lying in the Bombay terminus of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway, ready for shipment to England. Credit dries up. While the boom lasted, cotton merchants in India had vision of capturing the world market in raw cotton, permanently displacing America. The editors of the Bombay Gazette had asked in 1861, what can prevent India from supplanting the slave state of USA as the feeders of Lancashires? By 1865, these dreams were over. As the Civil War ended, cotton production in America revived, and Indian export to Britain steadily declined. Export merchants and sahukars in Maharashtra were no longer keen on extend long-term credit. They could see the demands for Indian cotton fall and cotton prices slide downward, so they decided to close down their operations, restrict their advances to peasants, and demand repayment of outside debt. With the credit dried up, the revenue demand increases. The first revenue settlement, as we have seen, was in the 1820 and 1830. Now it was the time for the next. And in the new settlement, the demand was increased dramatically from 50 to 100%. Could How could riots could pay this inflated demand at a time when the prices were falling and cotton field disappearing? Yet again they had to turn to moneylenders, but moneylender round refuses a loan. He no longer had confidence in the riot's capacity to repay. The experience of injustice, the refusal of moneylender to extend loans enlarged the riots were infuriated them was not simple that they had to go deeper and deeper into depth or that they were utterly depend on the moneylenders for survival, but that moneylenders were being insensitive to their plight. The moneylenders were violating the customary norms of the countryside. Moneylender lending was certainly widespread before the colonial rule, and moneylenders were often powerful. Figure a variety of customary norms regulated the relationship between moneylenders and the riots. One general norm was that the interest charge could not be more than principal. This was meant to limit the moneylenders' actions, exaction, and defined what would be counted as fair interest. Under colonial rule, these norms broken down. In one of many cases investigated by Deccan Rights Commission, the moneylender had charged over 2,000 as interest on the loan of 100. In petition after petition, rights complained of the injustice of such exaction and violation of custom. Deed of hire. When debt mounted, the peasant was unable to pay back the loan to moneylenders. He had no options but to give over all his possession, lands, carts, and animals to the moneylenders. But without animals, he could not continue to cultivate, so he took land on rent and animal on hire. Now had to pay for animals which had originally belonged to him. He had to sign a deed of hiring stating very clearly that this animal and carts are not belonging to him. To cases of conflict, these deeds could be enforced through the court. The following in the text of deed that a peasant signed in November 1873 from the record of Deccan Rights Commission. I have sold to you due to you my carriage having iron axle with their appurtenances for 4 bullocks. I have taken from you on hire under this deed the very same 2 carriage and 4 bullocks. I shall pay every month the hire thereof the rupees 4 a month and obtain a receipt in your own handwriting. In absence of receipt, I shall not contend that hiring had been paid. List all the commitments that the peasant is making in their need. What does society of hire tell us about the relationship between the peasants and the moneylender? How would it change the relationship between the peasants and the bullocks he previously owned? The riots came to see the moneylenders as devious and deceitful. They complained of moneylenders manipulating law and forcing accounts. In 1859, the British passed a limitation law that stated that the loans pounds signed between the moneylenders and riots would have valid for only 3 years. This law was meant to check the accumulation of interest over time. The moneylenders, however, turned the law around, forcing the riot to sign a new bond every 3 years. When new bond was signed, the unpaid balance, that is the original loan and the accumulated interest, was entered as principal on which a new set of interest charges was calculated. In petition that Deccan Rights Commission collected, riots describe how this process works. See source 10, and how moneylender use a variety of other means to short changes and riots. They refused to give receipt when the loan were repaid, enter the fictitious figure in bounds, acquire the peasants, harvest at low prices, and ultimately took over peasants' property. Deed and bond appeared as symbol of new oppressive system. In the past, such as deed had been rare. The British, however, were suspicious of transaction based on the informal understanding. As was common in past, the term transaction they believed had to be declared unambiguously and categorically stated in contract, deed and bonds, and regulated by law. Unless the deed or contract was legally enforceable, it had no value. Over the time, peasants came to associate the misery of their lives and the new regime of bonds and deeds. They were made to sign and put thumb impression on the document, but they did not know what they were actually signing. They had no idea of clauses that moneylender inserted in the bonds. They feared the written word. But they had no choice, because to survive they need loans, and moneylender were unwilling to give loan without legal bonds. How source 10, how debt mounted. In petition to the Deccan Rights Commission, a riot explain how the system of loan work. The sahukar leads his debtor ₹100 on bond at 3 annas percent per mensum. The latter agreed to pay the amount within 8 days from the passing of bond. 3 years after stipulated time for repaying the loan, sahukar take this debtor another bond for the principal and the interest together at the same rate of interest, allowing him 125 days to liquidate the debt. After the lapse of 3 years and 15 days, a third bond is passed by debtor. This process is repeated. At the end of 12 years, his interest is 1000 amount to rupees 2028, 10 annas 3 paisa. Calculate the interest rate that the Deccan Rights Commission. When the revolt spread in Deccan, the government of Bombay was initially unwilling to see in it as anything seriously, but government of India, worried by the memory of 1857, pre-assured of the government of Bombay to set up a commission to investigate into the cause of the riots. The commission produced a report that was represented to the British Parliament in 1878. This report, referred to as the Deccan Rights Report, provides historians with a range of sources for the study of the riots. The commission held inquiries in the district where the riots spread, recorded statements of the riots, sahukars and eyewitnesses, compiled statistical data on the revenue rates, prices and interest rate on the different region, and collated the report sent by district collector. Check what rate of interest are changing in the region where you live at present. Find out whatever these rates have the charge over the last 50 years in the variation of rates paid by the groups by the people. What was the reason for the difference? 200%. 200% rates हैं यहाँ पे. In looking at this such a source, have to again remember official service Deccan Rights Commission. 1765 East India Company acquired Diwani of Bengal. 1773 Regulating Act passed by British to regulate the activities of East India Company. 1793 Permanent settlement in Bengal. 1800 Santhal began to come in Rajmahal Hills and settle there. 1880 First revenue statement in the Bombay Deccan. 1820 agriculture prices began to fall. 1840-50 a slow process of agrarian expansion in Bombay Deccan. 1850-56 Santhal rebellion. 1868 cotton boom begins. 1875 riots in Deccan village repel. Answer is 100 on 142. Write a short essay in 250 to 301 in the following. क्या है? What are the Jotas powerful figure in many rural areas? How did Zamindar manage to retain control over Zamindaris? बिल्कुल easy. What did the Paharis respond to the coming of outsiders? ये बिल्कुल easy है. Why did Santhal rebel against the British rule? ये भी easy है. What explain an anger of Deccan Rights Commission Deccan against the moneylenders? Easy. Why were many zamindar auctioned after the permanent settlement? Easy. In what ways was the livelihood of Paharians different from the Santals? Easy. How did American Civil War affect the lives of riots in India? Cotton prices boom. Easy. What were the problems of using official source in the writing about history presence? Easy. Map work on the outlining of the sub-oriented, mark out the areas described in the chapter, find out where power settlements in the railway system were present, and the plots were on the map as well. Projects, choose one. Francis Buchalanian published report on the several districts of eastern India. Read one report and collect the information available about rural society, focusing on the themes rebel and the Raj, the revolt of 1857 and its representation. आज के लिए इतना ही रहने देते हैं, बाकी कल देखेंगे. ठीक है. ठीक. थैंक यू.